Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And, let's finally put this Goldie thing to rest and talk about his second album, Saturnz Return. Okay, this video has been a pretty long time coming, and is most likely the last video I'll ever be doing on the topic of Goldie, unless he releases another album that is of similar scale to The Journeyman, but I'm not gonna hold my breath. There are a lot of things I have to say about this album that need to come out at some point. See, this album is notable mainly for being very controversial. It gets a lot of hate. It gets some love, but mostly it just gets hate. I think people might be a bit lighter on it nowadays, but when it came out, it was pretty harshly panned, both by fans and critics. And I've kind of hinted on my thoughts on this album on my other reviews, but while I can kind of see where people are coming from, I don't agree. I've always enjoyed this album from when I first heard it, even though I did think it was maybe a bit overly long back then. Not really so much now. But, yeah, I've always enjoyed this album. I still find it perfectly enjoyable now. I still see myself returning to this one in the future as well. I don't think it deserves the hate it's gotten, and maybe people ought to give it another chance. In fact, I honestly put it on about equal footing with Timeless. And yeah, I said that. Sometimes, depending on my mood, I could also put this above Timeless. Granted, after hearing The Journeyman, tried some similar ideas and pulled them off better maybe. I don't know if this is one of those times. But yes, I do think Saturnz Return is a fantastic album all the same. So I'll address some of the main criticisms of this album. First of all, the length. This album is really freaking long, clocking in at about 2.5 hours. It's definitely an arduous and self-indulgent listen, to say the very least. Best enjoyed when you have plenty of time to spare. I mean, I'm not exactly gonna say it's like Audic or Elsic 1 through 5 levels of eye-poppingly ridiculous lengths, but certainly out of range for most people to go through in one sitting. I thankfully am not one of those people. I've tackled this album in one sitting more than a few times. I can confirm this album is less of a chore to get through with each listen. While I'll admit I really felt those 2.5 hours when I first heard it in my high school days. I think it was around then. But now it's no problem. I know the album really well and know exactly what I'm getting into. I won't deny it's a challenging listen that requires a lot of time out of the listener, but it is worth the effort if you ask me. Typical criticism number 2, I see, though, squarely revolves around our opening track, Mother. This is a very love it or hate it track, stretching on a little over an hour and being mostly like ambient orchestral piece, and a pretty repetitive and stripped back one at that. I can't remember where exactly I read this, but I think some professional review of this album called it like a pretentious ode to himself, and I remember thinking, wait, what? I won't deny the guy has a bit of an ego on him, but like... How is this track an ode to himself? It's called Mother, not Me. I did recently find out that he was abandoned by his mother as a child and was raised by foster parents. So I guess this is him channeling his angst over not having a real mother for most of his life, but come on, he's not celebrating himself or anything. I mean, yes, it is kind of edgy, but, you know, at least it comes from a sincere place. And yeah, I'm just gonna have to also say, I also happen to love this track myself. First of all, I tend to be a sucker for combining orchestral elements with electronic music. I can see why some people might find the long stretches of the same melodic themes to be boring, but it does work very well as an ambient piece to just, you know, lie back and relax to, and the vocals from Diane Charlemagne and Goldie himself are very nice and fit with the emotional track quite well. On top of that, I did say that this was mostly an ambient orchestral piece. There is a middle section that runs for about 20 minutes, I think, and more closely follows his typical style, combining those orchestral elements with a lot of fast-paced, banging drum and bass beats. If you ask me, this track is not only quite interesting, but also quite relaxing and emotional. I can definitely see why a lot of people don't care for it, but I think it's beautiful. I love that one. There are 2 more tracks that join Mother on the first disc of this album, Truth and The Dream Within, which are technically the same track, but, you know, the latter's a hidden track. Now, Truth, as I think I mentioned on my Journeyman review, is kind of an odd track, featuring lots of cloudy synth pads, and the vocals of David Bowie, of all people. To be honest, I never really cared for it all that much. I always thought it to be like really hazy and ambiguous, and I thought Bowie's voice was kind of a weird match for the song. And it wasn't until it was covered as a straight piano ballad on The Journeyman that I fully came around on it. But the hidden track here, The Dream Within, I had no problem getting into. It's a really haunting and creepy piece of dissonant pianos and voices so covered in reverb it's hard to make out what they're even saying. Really like this track and its atmosphere. The second disc, though, is where things get a little more complicated. First of all, this disc is called Saturn, and I'm just gonna be frank and say there are a lot of albums out there that remind me of space, and this is not one of them. The actual second disc of this album is pretty all over the place and doesn't come together very well, but I don't think there are any bad tracks on here either. Thing is, there are more than a few tracks which are very loud, harsh, and/or bombastic, placed next to several tracks that are more chill and laid back. Like, it starts out with probably the most intense and angry track on here, Temper Temper, which features Goldie himself screaming and spazzing over the distorted feedbacky guitar work of Noel Gallagher. That's certainly an interesting way to start out. Digital, meanwhile, brings on rapper KRS-One, a name that I am never going to forget because not only is his rapping pretty solid on this track, but the repeatedly saying his name is weirdly catchy and probably the first time I ever got into a rap track at all. Like, when I first heard Saturnz Return, that was back in my early high school days, when I thought for whatever reason that all rap music is crap or something like that. And I think it is a little out of place by being by far the least serious track on an otherwise very serious album, but you know what, I'll take it as a moment of fun levity, still enjoy the track. And then, I'll Be There For You, which tricked me for a second into thinking The Art of Noise came in to work with Goldie, but he just sampled their track with Malcolm McLaren, or however you say that. The track is Buffalo Gals. And, you know, this is another solid track, and that harp sample that he uses is used to beautiful effect. And then we go to Believe, which suddenly takes us into this jazzy and almost poppy vocal track that even turns down the tempo somewhat. It's super chill and laid back, and by this point it's easy to forget that Goldie was screaming in angst only 3 tracks earlier. I guess it's not like he made a sharp transition from Temper Temper to Believe. He did kind of ease us in that way. Then it's transitioned into Dragonfly pretty neatly. It's the longest track on here at 16 minutes, at least on this disc of the album. And it's also like kind of an extended chill jazz piece. Just, you know, raising the tempo back up to the normal fast pace of the rest of the album. And this is probably my favorite track on this half of the album too, with all its various jazzy melodies coming and going. I think it'd have been my pick for a track to end this album on. But unfortunately after this, it gets a little more shaky transition-wise. We got Chico, Death of a Rock Star, which is of course a 2-parter track, which is rather loud and total banger material with a lot of screechy, distorted guitars in the first half that reminds you, oh yeah, this half of the album started out really angsty and angry, didn't it? Not a bad track, but probably my least favorite, mainly because it doesn't really stand out that much. But then takes yet another turn on Letter of Fate, which is suddenly completely ambient. It's just synth pads, Goldie's voice, and a reprisal of his whispering from The Dream Within. And it's just like depths of despair depressing. It just seems to show him like, I don't care, he's writing a suicide note or something. Like, just, jeez. Goldie really pouring his dark side out there all over this album. Then we get Fury the Origin, another 2-parter banger track, in which the second half reprises that vocal snippet from This Is a Bad from Timeless. I did say that I didn't really care for This Is a Bad, mainly because I was used to this track, and while, you know, This Is a Bad is probably less intense, it's also more melodic, Fury the Origin lives up to both of its titles. I guess the Origin refers to going back to the first album again. I guess this track could work next to Letter of Fate, given how they're both on the darker side of Goldie, but then we take another heel turn with Crystal Clear, which is another, like, fast-paced, jazzy, up-tempo vocal track. I mean, he's still really good, totally getting some Herbie Hancock, Headhunters, jazz fusion vibes out of this one. But then we take yet another heel turn with the closer, Demons. Yet another banger track that does have the benefit of being by far the catchiest of the banger tracks on this album. Just gets stuck in your head and stays there. But as far as being the ending to this album, nah, it doesn't really work. Aside from just being catchy, there's nothing really that sticks out about it, and it's kind of a lackluster finish to an album that had so much emotional weight to it elsewhere. And plenty of other choices for ending tracks that could have been so much more potent. I personally would have picked Dragonfly for the ending to finish this otherwise pretty dark album with some good vibes and a fittingly large-scale piece. But if you really wanted to cement the dark nature of this album, you could have closed with Letter of Fate, and really left people with shivers going down their spine like the first disc did. Like I said, all 10 of these tracks are good, it's just they could have been ordered better. I don't even mind the fact that tracks as complete polar opposites as Temper, and Believe are on the same album. Well, first of all, I think Goldie does a decent enough job of easing you on that part of the album, and I guess the occasionally jarring transitions, especially near the end of the album, could be explained away as showing, Goldie's head being kind of all over the place and unstable. Granted, I've listened to this album enough that the track placement doesn't feel off to me anymore. I'm just used to the album flowing the way it does, but I can't deny it could have been presented better, especially ending with Demons. That's a good song, but it would have been better off earlier on in the album. All that said, while I may have preferred Goldie to change the track order around a little more, fact remains that I still enjoy every second of this album. Even the less memorable banger tracks work for me in the context of the album given how dark it could get in places. And I was already immediately on the side of the lighter and poppier vocal tracks, which, while tonally inconsistent, sounded too good for me to actually care. Especially when I first heard the album, they are still among my favorite moments on the album. But I think above all, the thing I have to recommend Saturnz Return for the most is just Goldie taking so many chances and not holding back on any ideas he's had. And they're all good ideas. Goldie was really pushing the drum and bass genre in every which way on this album and taking it as far as he possibly could, while still remaining pretty consistently enjoyable the whole time. Sure, there were some parts that people didn't like, and sure, it turned out kind of messy, but I think this album really exemplifies what could be done with this genre, and what it had the potential to be. And on top of that, Goldie very clearly poured out so much blood, sweat, and tears into this album. He was putting out his darkest emotions out for all to see, and he was trying so many different experiments on it too. It's definitely a challenging listen, but it's one that I have a ton of respect for, and I recommend just as highly as Timeless or The Journeyman. These three albums, while only the former has actually attained legendary status in the public eye, I personally hold in about equally high regard. Timeless, our introduction to Goldie and his unique sound, Saturnz Return showing him experimenting and throwing his entire self and inner demons out there, and Journeyman showing him looking back on his life and all he's done, albeit in a more positive and accessible light. I recommend all of these albums, and while I only have the CD of the Journeyman right now, I still think they all deserve a spot on my shelf at some point. Still, Saturnz Return is, in my opinion, a highly underrated album that, while I personally need to be in a certain mood to enjoy to the fullest extent, I say is totally worth people's time, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.